Beverly Tillery, Executive Director of AVP, the largest anti-LGBT violence organization in the country. Okay, so a little bit about Beverly and what she does here. NYC Anti-Violence Project, AVP, empowers lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and HIV-affected communities and allies to end all forms of violence through organization and education, and support survivors through counseling and advocacy. AVP envisions a world in which all lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and HIV-affected people are safe, respected, and live free from violence. We are thrilled to be joined by AVP's Executive Director, Beverly Tillery, to discuss the organization's beginnings, current initiatives, and future. So please welcome Beverly Tillery. Oh, Beverly, I think you're still muted there.
There we go. Hi.
Oh, perfect. Hi. Great. Great. And I believe we have your moderator here as well that'll be asking you some questions. Zara, are you there?
I am indeed.
Hello. Okay, I'll turn it over to you two.
Awesome.
Thank you
so much, Hunter. Hi, Beverly. I'm so excited to chat a little bit more with you today. So I'd love to start the session by learning a little bit more about yourself and the work of the New York City Anti-Violence Project.
Sure. Well, for myself, I would say that I am an organizer by trade, which to me means that I've spent my career looking at social injustice and thinking about how to bring together communities who are impacted by that injustice to create change and make the world better. And I have the fortune of having, been able to work in a lot of great organizations. Right now, I am at the New York City Anti-Violence Project, which is the largest organization around the country that really focuses on addressing violence in the LGBTQ community. And we do that by supporting survivors of violence and working to change the conditions that create violence in the first place.
I love that. That work it's so important. And I love that it's like more of the grassroots organizing, that you're talking about. I also love that we're both based in New York City. This is very near and dear to my heart. And I know that there's a lot of work to be done. So I'm excited to be chatting with you a little bit more about that today.
I feel like there's so many ways that we in New York get to set examples of things that people can be doing all across the country and not to be so New York centric. It is a great city, but we it's also sometimes the microcosm of both the good and the bad, the problems and the solutions.
Yeah, that's so true.
To address.
There's just so many people, and so many different identities that folks bring. And you definitely, you nailed it, right? When you said like, it's the good and the bad, right? But we can really set the example. I love that. I love that framing.
Yeah.
Great. So we'd love to hear from you. What are some of the resources that are available through the New York City Anti-Violence Project for the LGBTQIA+ community?
Yeah, AVP is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, which is
congratulations.
Really yeah, thank you. And from our very beginning, we were actually founded by a group of gay men in Chelsea who were responding to hate violence. And from the very beginning, they decided that they wanted to do two things. They wanted to give survivors support. So the way they started to do that is that they started a hotline. And our hotline has been running consistently for 40 years. It's now bilingual, it's 24 hours. So a lot of the service that we provide is we are able to help people in immediate crisis and also at any time when you're, experiencing trauma or the result of violence that you faced. You can call our hotline, and there are amazing staff and volunteers who can support folks through whatever moment they're in. A lot of times we help people with what we call safety planning, which is just helping you create a plan in that moment so that you can be as safe as possible. And then we can connect folks to free counseling services, legal services. And then again, like I said, we have an organizing team. So if you're at the point in your survivorship or as an ally that you realize that, you know, this is bigger than just one incident or you know, one person's issues, then you can connect with other people who are working to change policies and really create new models for safety across the city and across the country.
I love that. I love that you're thinking bigger, right? It's not just about one thing. It's really thinking about shifting larger systems.
Yes.
And I think it's so important that the hotline is 24 hours, right? Like New York City is famously the city that never sleeps, right? And so I love that this hotline has been in existence for 40 years. That's amazing. I can't even imagine how many individuals must have been helped through that hotline. Yes. That's amazing. Great. So we're gonna
in this last year, when we were going through the pandemic, we always say it's a lifeline for folks, but you know, when people were sheltering in place, it was so much more of a lifeline. Many people were sheltering in place with the folks who were causing them harm.
Right.
So being able to connect to somebody who you know understands what you're going through, has some resources for you, can help you figure out you know, really what's the best thing for you, because we do believe that survivors know what they need. You know, we just help them, you know, sometimes kind of take a step back and realize that. But, you know, it's amazing the things that we're able to support people with through the hotline.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, that point you made about this pandemic has been tough for various people for different reasons, you know, but really thinking about folks having to shelter in with perhaps folks who have been abusing them or in just tough situations. That's something that I think people often don't think about. You know, we're so busy focused on like, well, we can't go out and like there's a lockdown or whatever, but there's like deeper situations happening. And I think that's why the work that you were doing is just so important.
Yeah, we heard, I think, more during the beginning part of the pandemic about intimate partner violence, which that is definitely a reality. But for the LGBTQ community, some people were also experiencing violence from family members. You know, I think about all of the students who had to go back home to maybe not so supportive households, and you know, they were continuing their education while they were at home. We heard from many people who were experiencing violence from landlords, particularly at a time when folks didn't necessarily have money to pay their rent, and there was, you know, we had gotten some rent relief. But that didn't mean that landlords weren't, you know, continuing to harass people.
Yep.
So there were a lot of different ways that people were experiencing violence throughout the pandemic that I think we haven't necessarily thought about. And, you know, that all, it's not like that's gone away yet.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think even just raising awareness around that is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So would love to hear from you as a leader in this industry and community. What are some valuable experiences that you'd like to share with other fellow leaders in the audience? And also on that same line, how do we increase visibility for the LGBTQIA+ community in a workplace?
Oh, goodness, those are big questions.
We can tackle them one at a time, don't worry.
Well, let me start with the visibility question, because in some ways that's easier than the valuable experiences because there's so many. And, you know, I will say that, you know, I'm always thinking about leadership and representation. And so one thing definitely that people can do to support LGBTQ folks in their own workplaces is, you know, look at your leadership and think about how if your leadership is not really representative of the whole community, of all of our communities, you know, what can you do about that? If you are in a position where you can actually make some change, think about, of course, you know, practices for hiring and supporting and creating pipelines for folks, because it really does matter, you know, that question of, you know, for workplaces, it really does matter the mix of people that you have in place who are making all kinds of decisions. And many of the decisions that we're making are based on like what we know from our own experiences. So obviously, I mean, you know, I think everybody who's watching understands that, but being really intentional about it. And if you don't have, you know, that diversity in your leadership, if you don't have representation, then you don't have to, you know, don't just stop there. But think about what you can do over time. And also think about, you know, actually I was having this conversation with my management team just this week. Think about what are the ways that you can make sure that the voices that aren't around the tables that are making decisions can still be represented. So who else in your organization can you pull in? Do you have you know, an employee resource group that can be a part of, you know, some of that decision making and you know, leadership in your organization if you don't have it, you know, in your management. But really, you know, just thinking about that, communicating that intention to your other staff, to your staff and your employees. And if you're not in a position of leadership at all, thinking about ways that you have even little bits of power where you can elevate the voices and experiences of LGBTQ people, you know, from bringing in speakers during Pride Month to maybe bringing in speakers in October when people are not thinking about, you know, the LGBTQ community and Pride, to simple things, you know, like just building alliances with people that are on staff and intentionally asking how you can be supportive.
Yeah, no, that resonates with me so deeply. The piece around really like how do we make sure voices are represented even if they're not at the table. You know, I love that, and I love that intentionality. I would love to hear from you. I know originally I had asked you for some valuable experiences. I'd love to hear just one valuable experience from your end that you can share with other leaders within the audience.
Can you give me a little bit more direction around valuable experience? What point me in the right direction?
Yeah, it's more around, you know, a valuable experience advocating for LGBTQ folks, like within your workplace.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so then I have a really great story from the work of our organization that I'm really proud of, and I think it's important to share. You know, in our work, one of the things that we've done over the last few years is really intentionally say that we are centering and prioritizing the folks who are most impacted by violence in our community. So that really translates to people who are more marginalized, people of color, trans and gender nonconforming folks, people who are low income, immigrants, non-English speakers, et cetera. And in doing so over the years, you know, we've seen our work shifting. You know, it creates so many more opportunities for us to look at issues or dive into issues that we hadn't necessarily thought about or weren't really sure how to do before. I want to tell you the story of Laylene Polanco, who was a young Black and Latinx trans woman who lived in New York. And a couple of years ago, she, you know, had a tragic situation in that she had gotten arrested and incarcerated at Rikers Island. she was put in solitary confinement because for trans women, our institutions have a hard time keeping them safe. And so often they are put in solitary confinement for their own safety. And, you know, we know solitary confinement is not safe for anyone. She was put in solitary confinement. She also had epilepsy, and folks at Rikers Island were well aware that she had epilepsy, and she died in her cell at Rikers Island. And, you know, way too much time went by before someone checked in on her, and it was a horrible, tragic situation. And her family, when they found out what had happened to her, because they didn't know that she had been at Rikers, they immediately became activists. And, you know, they had always supported her. And, you know, they made it their point to really to use this opportunity as an opportunity to fight for other trans women of color who, you know, often find themselves in a similar situation and don't have anybody to speak up for them. And her family came to AVP and asked for help, and we really helped them sort of push for some changes at Rikers Island, for accountability for the guards who were not doing what they needed to do to make sure that she was protected. And together, you know, we were able to really push the city to make some significant changes. Her family got, you know, the largest ever settlement from Rikers for the abuse and, you know, the tragedy that they caused. And we have been able to push a conversation about trans and gender nonconforming folks who are incarcerated, what they need, about bail reform, because Laylene should have been out on bail and not incarcerated. And also about really what our society needs to be thinking about in terms of how we are criminalizing so many members of our community, many who are LGBTQ, who find themselves, you know, incarcerated and caged just because of who they are. So, you know, out of a really horrible, tragic situation, you know, we've had many hundreds and thousands of people in New York City and across the country talking about these issues. Having, you know, pushing the mayor around closing Rikers Island and thinking about, you know, what are alternatives to that. Yeah. And I think, you know, obviously Laylene should be with us today. And, you know, the reality is that she isn't. But the reason that I wanted to share this story is, one, to make people aware of, you know, some of the reality for trans women of color and folks in our communities who are criminalized, but also to really say that there are always ways that we can push for change. And there's so much power in us bringing our voices together, making other people aware, sharing stories and telling our stories, and then creating space for people to come together and support and demand change. So, you know, that's, you know, one example of how we really try to think about, you know, in the midst of violence and tragedy that we deal with all the time, what are the ways that we can turn that around and make solutions and, again, create situations so other people don't have to experience that same violence.
I think, you know, based off of even just the topic that we were just talking about, we actually got a question from Craig who's asking, does your organization experience police in the community as an ally?
Not nearly enough. And, I would say, because we have the hotline is a huge source of data. So we mine that for data about what's going on in our community.
Right.
And over the years, even since the organization's inception, back in 40 years ago, one of the things that people, were consistently saying is the police was not responsive to the violence that people were experiencing.
Right.
And often are another source of violence for our community. While, there might be individual police officers who are certainly allies, and, a lot of times, many people in our community don't want to go to the police when they experience violence because they know that they may be either more severely traumatized, they might be re-victimized, and they might experience other kinds of violence from the police. So we feel like the police don't really make us safe. And we're really pushing to create new models of safety that are community-based, that are not reliant on police, and recognizing that the police are a really important part of a system that is about criminalizing our communities. And we need to move away from that. Yeah, it's a really great time to actually be having these conversations across the country, given all of the things that we've been learning and experiencing around police violence, and all of the opportunities for reform and change.
Yeah. No, this is great, and this is super, informative, and I hope that the audience is really listening and engaged as well. And I would like to welcome the audience to send any questions you may have in the last few minutes, so we can ask Beverly them. And then I have a question for you, Beverly. In the meantime, as we wait for questions from the audience, you worked with Lambda Legal for 11 years, and would love if you could share, just a moment or so about just the stigma around HIV, and how that stigma is really tampering with how the LGBTQIA+ community obtains HIV-related services, and what are some ways that we can support folks that we know who might have been diagnosed with HIV. Would love to just hear a little bit from you.
Yeah, I feel really proud and fortunate that both at Lambda Legal and at AVP now, those are two organizations that have been very intentional about part of our mission is to be inclusive of people living with HIV. And I think that intentionality is really important, because we also need to recognize that, of course, HIV has always and will always be an LGBTQ issue. Yeah. There are unique experiences that people living with HIV have. And of course, the HIV community is broader than the LGBT community as well. And, I think, first I will say stigma is still really real. And one of the things that I've learned working at AVP is how the intersection of HIV status and sexual orientation and gender identity can play out in terms of violence that people experience, as well as access to resources and services as well. I think what comes with the stigma a lot is that there's sort of this assumption that we as a society know better about how people living with HIV should live their lives, how they should, love, who they should interact with, how they interact. Talking about criminalization, there are still really, intense ways that people living with HIV are criminalized in our society. I remember at Lambda Legal working on, and I'm not an attorney, by the way, but working with the attorneys who were representing people who were being charged with crimes because of whether or not they disclose their status.
Wow.
And one of the things that is really most important for people to think about in terms of the stigma with HIV is that self-determination of people is so important, because that stigma exposes them to all kinds of discrimination and violence. And just to give you an example from the violence side, I think that we don't really think about, at AVP, one of the realities that we deal with a lot is ways that people who are living with HIV, that can be used as a weapon against them in many situations. And, you can think about the intimate partner situation as one that is really sort of paints a clear picture. So imagine a trans woman who's living with HIV who has an abusive partner. And that partner may be one of few people who knows that she is living with HIV. And so that knowledge, because of the stigma that is in our larger society, can be used in a lot of different ways as a weapon. It can be used by threatening her that they will tell people that she works with, or even people in her family who she might not have disclosed to. And that threat can be enough to keep her in an unsafe situation, in a violent situation. We've seen examples of people who are living with HIV where abusive partners have taken their medication and use that as a weapon against them, right? If you don't do what I want you to do or act the way I want you to act, you will not get your medication back. So there are lots of ways that we don't think about it, but that again, because of the stigma in society, that can be used against people and also puts people in more vulnerable and dangerous situations.
I think it's actually very helpful to have you share examples like that, because again, like you said, I think folks sometimes don't think about like the threat of knowledge, like having certain knowledge and what you can do with that and the impact that can have on folks. So I think, thank you for sharing those examples. It makes it a little bit more like real to understand.
Because all those examples of violence, it is about power, right? So anything that you have that you can use to wield power over somebody else, is what abusers and people who are causing violence will do on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, that's awful, but helpful to know and be aware of.
Yeah.
And I also just want to be mindful. We only have a few moments left. I would love to hear from you in the final few moments, like how this work that you're doing is obviously very important, and would love to know how can we get more involved with the New York City Anti-Violence Project? What support might you need from us or the audience?
We always need lots of support from throughout the community. We are, people can go to our website. They can certainly make a donation. Our website is avp.org. We are always looking for partners to work with us. We have an amazing team on our staff who also do a lot of really powerful trainings. From LGBTQ and TGNC 101s to bystander intervention. How do you intervene if you see violence happening, in the community, in the street, wherever you are, to anti-oppression, which I think is really helpful for organizations and institutions. If anyone is interested in joining us as a corporate sponsor to support any of our events or the work that we do, please reach out, and people can reach out to me directly. And then we power our work with volunteers. So there's so many ways that people can get involved. One huge way is that our hotline is really staffed by tons and tons of volunteers. And if people are really interested in that kind of work and support, we run a hotline training every few months. And you have to commit to a 40-hour training to do it, but it's really enriching, and people who go through that training are certified rape crisis counselors for the state. And then if you don't want to do such heavy work as, answering calls on our hotline, there are all kinds of ways that you can get involved with us in community. So just reach out.
That's awesome. And as you've mentioned several times, that hotline has really been, seems like a crucial, almost life-saving tool and resource for many folks within New York City. So Beverly, I just want to thank you so much for sharing such information, your experiences, being so honest, and just helping educate myself and the audience more about the work that you do and the challenges that LGBTQIA+ folks may face within New York City. So thank you so much again for your time. And folks, if you are interested to learn more, as Beverly shared her website at the Anti-Violence Project. Thank you so much, Beverly.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Zara, and thank you, Beverly. Again, everyone, that website that you can go to is avp.org to get involved. Thank you both.